It was a cold night in the city. The streets were quiet. Most people were asleep. Only a few cars drove by, their headlights shining on wet pavement. At the front of a small police station, a dog stood alone. He was a big, scruffy German shepherd with dark eyes and a thick coat. His name was Shadow, though no one knew that yet. Shadow barked, loud and sharp. Woof, woof, woof. Inside the police station, Officer Ramirez looked up from his desk. He sighed and shook his head. "That dog's been out there for 10 minutes, he said to his partner, Officer Grant. "What's he barking at?" "Probably a squirrel," Grant said, not looking up from his paperwork. But Shadow didn't stop. He barked again. Then he ran in circles. He pawed at the glass door. His tail was stiff. His ears were alert. He looked at the door, then ran a few steps away. Then came back and barked again, louder this time. Ramirez frowned. "That's not normal barking," he said. "He's trying to get someone's attention." Grant shrugged. "It's a stray. Just ignore it. He'll go away." But Shadow didn't go away. He ran off into the night, disappearing into the shadows. Ramirez stood and walked to the window. "There he goes," he said quietly. Less than 2 minutes later, Shadow returned, barking, jumping at the door, scratching the sidewalk. "Okay," Ramirez said. He grabbed his coat. "I'm checking it out." "You're serious?" Grant asked. "Come on. Look at him. He wants something." Ramirez stepped outside. The cold air hit his face. Shadow barked once, then took off, running down the sidewalk. "Hey, wait," Ramirez called. Shadow stopped and turned, as if saying, "Come on." Then he ran again. Ramirez jogged after him. They passed closed stores, dark alleyways, and parked cars. Shadow ran with purpose. He looked back often to make sure the officer was still behind him. "Where are you taking me, boy?" Ramirez asked, breathing hard. Finally, Shadow stopped in front of a broken-down building. It was an old warehouse. Part of the roof had collapsed. It looked like no one had been inside for years. Shadow barked again, louder than ever. Then he ran to a small opening in the wall and sniffed. Ramirez pulled out his flashlight. "What is it, boy?" Then he heard something. A faint sound. A small, weak voice. "Help." Ramirez's eyes widened. "Is someone in there?" He called for backup on his radio, then knelt by the hole. "Hello? Can you hear me? Hold on. We're coming." Shadow pawed at the entrance, whining now. He lay down beside the opening, pressing his ear close. The voice came again, quieter this time. "Please." Minutes later, help arrived. Firefighters and police worked fast, cutting through the debris. Underneath a pile of old wood and trash, they found her. A little girl, curled up, shivering, dirt on her cheeks, holding a stuffed bear tight in her arms. Shadow stepped forward and sniffed her hand. His tail wagged once. The girl opened her eyes and smiled faintly. "Shadow," she whispered. Ramirez stared. You know this dog." The girl nodded slowly. "He's mine. He found me." Everyone stood in silence. Shadow sat next to her, as if guarding her. He hadn't just barked for help. He had come to rescue someone he loved. The ambulance lights flashed red and white as the little girl was lifted onto a stretcher. Her name was Emily, and she was only 7 years old. Shadow stayed by her side the whole time. When the paramedics tried to move closer, he growled softly. Not angry, just scared. He didn't want them to take her away. "It's okay, boy," Officer Ramirez said gently. He knelt next to the dog. "They're helping her. You did your part." Shadow looked into Ramirez's eyes and slowly stepped back, still watching Emily as they carried her into the ambulance. "Shadow," Emily whispered again before the doors closed. Ramirez stood in the cold night air, staring at the old warehouse. He shook his head in disbelief. That dog, he saved her. His radio crackled. Any update on the child's ID? Another officer asked. She says the dog is hers, Ramirez replied. We're taking him with us. He's not just a stray. Not tonight. At the hospital, Emily lay in a small hospital bed with warm blankets tucked around her. Her parents rushed in as soon as they got the call. Tears ran down her mother's face. We've been looking everywhere, she said, holding Emily close. We thought we lost you. I was trying to follow Shadow, Emily said softly. I thought I saw him outside. But then I got lost. And the building fell. Her dad sat beside her, eyes full of emotion. How did he find you? I don't know, Emily whispered, smiling. But he came back. Shadow waits. Outside the hospital, Ramirez waited with Shadow. The dog lay on a blanket, resting. His paws were dirty. His fur was messy, but his eyes were calm. He had done what he came to do. Soon, a nurse stepped out. You can bring him in. The girl keeps asking for her dog. Ramirez smiled and opened the door. When Shadow entered the hospital room, Emily's face lit up like sunshine. Shadow, she cried. He jumped gently onto the bed and laid his head on her lap. She hugged him tight. Her heart was full. A surprising truth. Later that day, Officer Ramirez checked Shadow's old records. He found something surprising. Emily's family gave up Shadow to the shelter months ago, he said. They couldn't keep him when they moved into a smaller home. He escaped the shelter last week, added a shelter worker. We thought he ran off for good. But he didn't run away, Ramirez said, smiling. He went looking for Emily. News spreads fast. The next morning, Emily's story was all over the news. Lost Dilgi Savies Lost Jarl. Loyal Pup Torre down his young Omener. Shadow the hero. People couldn't believe it. A dog, alone in a big city, found his way back to the one person who needed him most. Some called it luck. Others called it love. At school, kids talked about Shadow. On the streets, strangers asked how they could help. Shadow became a local hero. One problem remains, but not everything was perfect. Emily's family still lived in a small apartment where dogs weren't allowed. Her parents were afraid they couldn't keep Shadow, even after what he'd done. Ramirez heard about this and frowned. That dog didn't bark and run through the night just to be sent away again. He had an idea, but it would take the whole town to help. The days after Emily's rescue were full of happy moments. Emily and Shadow were together again. She couldn't stop hugging him, and he stayed by her side all the time. He followed her everywhere, whether it was to the kitchen, the living room, or even the bathroom. He was her protector, and she was his best friend. But soon, a problem appeared. The apartment building where Emily's family lived didn't allow dogs. Emily's parents knew that Shadow couldn't stay in their small, crowded home much longer. The landlord had already warned them that pets were not allowed. Emily's mom, Sarah, and her dad, Mike, were scared. They knew they couldn't break the rules. I can't imagine not having Shadow here, Emily said one evening, holding the dog close. I know, sweetheart, Sarah said quietly. But the landlord, we don't have a choice. Mike sighed. We'll figure something out. Maybe we can move to a different place. But moving wasn't easy. They didn't have a lot of money, and finding a new place that allowed dogs was difficult. Emily felt worried. She loved Shadow so much, and the thought of losing him again made her heart ache. A plan for Shadow. Officer Ramirez knew how important Shadow was to Emily. He could see how close they were and how much the dog meant to her. So he decided to help. He wasn't going to let Shadow be sent away after everything he had done. One evening, Ramirez gathered some friends, local people who had heard the story of Shadow's heroism. They all agreed that something needed to be done. It wasn't just about the dog. It was about what Shadow represented. He wasn't just a pet. He was a symbol of loyalty, love, and courage. I know a place, said Mrs. Jenkins, a local teacher who had heard the story. There's a farm just outside the town. It's huge, and they love dogs there. That's a good idea, said Ramirez, but we need to make sure Emily and her family can afford it. I'll talk to the landlord and see if we can find a way around the rules, said another neighbor, Mr. Harris. Maybe they'll make an exception for a hero dog. The town comes together. The next day, word about Shadow's situation spread through the small town. People began showing their support. Neighbors offered to help with moving costs. The local store even started selling Save Shadow t-shirts, with all the money going to Emily's family. Some children made handmade signs with pictures of Shadow, holding them up at the bus stop. Shadow is a hero. Save him. Read one sign. Ramirez contacted the shelter where Shadow had been before. He asked if they had any advice on how to keep the dog with Emily. The shelter manager, Mrs. Green, smiled when she heard Shadow's story. I never thought I'd see this day, she said. That dog was something special from the start. If there's anything we can do to help, just let me know. A big decision. A week later, the landlord called Emily's family. Sarah felt her heart sink. She knew it wasn't going to be good news, but to her surprise, the landlord wasn't angry. I've heard about what happened with your dog, he said. People around here seem to think he's a hero. I'll give you 1 more month to find a solution. If you can't, I'll have to ask you to leave. Emily's heart raced. 1 more month. That was barely enough time. But then her father, Mike, had an idea. We'll take him to the farm, Mike said. We can make it work. It'll be good for Shadow. He deserves a place where he can run free. Emily nodded. She loved the idea of Shadow being able to run on a big farm where he could play and explore. But she wasn't ready to say goodbye. I'll miss him so much, she said, her voice shaking. I know, sweetheart, Mike said softly. But this is the best thing for him. And we'll visit him, I promise. The big day. On the day they were supposed to move, Emily hugged Shadow tightly. I'll come back, I swear. I love you, Shadow. Shadow wagged his tail and licked her face. He understood. He always understood. Ramirez, the neighbors, and everyone who had helped pitched in for the move. They packed Emily's things and loaded up the car. And as the family drove toward the farm, Emily felt a mix of sadness and hope. Shadow may have saved her life, but now she was going to give him a new life, a place where he could run and be free. And Emily knew one thing for sure. No matter where Shadow went, they would always be together, in heart and spirit. The farm was bigger than Emily had imagined. There were green fields stretching as far as she could see, and a huge red barn at the far end of the land. The sun was setting, casting a warm orange glow over everything. Shadow seemed to sense it too, his tail wagging as soon as he stepped out of the car. This place is perfect for you, Shadow, Emily said softly, her voice full of hope. She opened the car door, and Shadow jumped out, sniffing the air, his nose twitching. He barked once, as if to say, "This is home." Mike and Sarah helped Emily carry her things to the small house on the farm. It wasn't big, but it was cozy. The farmer, Mr. Thompson, was waiting for them by the barn. He was a kind man with a weathered face and a gentle smile. I'm glad you came, Mr. Thompson said. This place is great for dogs. Shadow can run and play all day long. He'll love it here. Emily smiled, feeling a little better. She could see Shadow running in the fields, chasing butterflies, and rolling in the grass. It was exactly what he needed. The first days on the farm. The first few days were full of excitement for Shadow. Every morning, Emily would wake up to find him wagging his tail, ready for another adventure. He had plenty of room to run, and the farmer even let him follow him around the fields while he worked. Shadow loved it. He chased squirrels up trees, sniffed every corner of the barn, and even made a few animal friends, like the chickens and the farm dog Buddy. But Emily still missed him. She visited him every weekend, and every time she left, her heart felt heavy. I wish you could come home with me, she said, wiping away a tear. Shadow seemed to understand. He would follow her to the car, his eyes full of longing. It had been months since Shadow had moved to the farm. Emily visited him almost every weekend, but the days she spent without him felt long. Still, she knew he was happy there. Shadow had made a home for himself, and he had even become a hero to the other animals on the farm. One Saturday morning, Emily was sitting in her room, reading a book, when she heard a knock on the door. "Come in," she called. Her dad, Mike, stepped into the room with a smile on his face. "Guess what?" he said, holding out a letter. Emily looked up, surprised. "What is it?" "It's from the local animal shelter," he said. "They want to recognize Shadow for everything he's done." Emily's heart skipped a beat. "Really? What did they say?" Mike opened the letter and read aloud. "In honor of his bravery and his unwavering loyalty to his owner, Shadow the German Shepherd has been nominated as Hero Dog of the Year. We would like to invite you and Shadow to a ceremony next month, where he will be recognized by the community for his courageous actions." Emily's eyes filled with tears. "Shadow, Hero Dog of the Year," she whispered. It was hard to believe. Shadow was just a dog, but to her, he had always been more than that. He had saved her life, and now he was being honored for it. "We have to go," Emily said, her voice full of excitement. "We have to bring Shadow." The ceremony took place at the town hall, and the whole town showed up to support Shadow. There were banners with pictures of him, and people wore t-shirts that read #HeroDogShadow. Emily was so proud of her dog, but also a little nervous. Shadow was used to the quiet life on the farm, and now he was going to be the center of attention. When Emily and her family arrived, they were greeted by the mayor. "Thank you for bringing Shadow," he said with a smile. "This is a special day for all of us." Emily knelt down beside Shadow, giving him a quick hug. "Are you ready for this, boy?" she asked. Shadow looked up at her, tail wagging, as if to say, "I'm always ready." The ceremony began with a few speeches from local leaders, praising Shadow for his bravery. "Without Shadow, we may not have found Emily in time," one of the police officers said. "He saved a life, and he continues to make a difference in this community." Then the mayor stepped forward holding the shiny plaque. "Shadow, on behalf of the town and everyone who knows you, we honor you today as our hero dog. You have shown us the true meaning of loyalty, love, and courage." The crowd cheered, and Emily's heart swelled with pride. She couldn't believe it. This was the dog who had once been lost, astray on the streets, and now he was the hero everyone admired. A new home for Shadow. After the ceremony, the crowd gathered for pictures and to congratulate Emily and Shadow. But as the day went on, something unexpected happened. One of the local families, the Carsons, approached Emily. They were kind people who had heard about Shadow's story from the news. The Carsons had a large house with a big backyard. "We have been thinking," Mrs. Carson said. "We know that Shadow is happy on the farm, but we would love to offer him a permanent home here with us. We have plenty of room, and we promise to give him the love he deserves." Emily was surprised. She had always believed that Shadow was happy on the farm, but she also knew that the Carsons were good people. They had a big family and loved dogs. "Would you want to stay with us, Shadow?" Emily asked, kneeling beside him. "You could live with us, in a big yard, with lots of space to run around." Shadow looked at Emily, then at the Carsons. He sniffed their hands, then wagged his tail. It seemed like he was considering the offer. Emily turned to her parents, her eyes full of questions. "What do you think?" Mike and Sarah exchanged a glance. "It's up to you, Emily," Sarah said softly. "But if you think this would be a good home for Shadow, then we'll support you." Emily took a deep breath. She knew that Shadow loved her, but he deserved a place where he could have the best of both worlds, the love of a family and the freedom to roam. A new beginning. The next day, Emily drove to the farm with her parents. Shadow came along, of course. It was time for him to say goodbye to the farm and begin his new life with the Carsons. When they arrived, Emily gave Shadow one last hug. "You'll always be my hero," she whispered, her voice full of emotion. Shadow licked her face as if to say, "I'll always be with you." As they left, Emily felt a mix of sadness and hope. Shadow was beginning a new chapter of his life, one filled with love, space to run, and a family who cared for him deeply. And as for Emily, she knew that Shadow would always have a special place in her heart. No matter where he went, they would never be apart. Their bond was unbreakable. One particular Saturday, as Emily sat on the porch steps with Shadow beside her, she reflected on how much had changed since that fateful night when Shadow had saved her. He was no longer just a dog. He was a hero, a friend, and a part of her heart. "I don't know what I would have done without you, Shadow," Emily whispered, stroking his fur. "You gave me everything." Shadow rested his head on her lap, as if he understood every word. They had been through so much together, and though they now lived in different homes, they still shared the same love and loyalty. A new adventure. As the seasons changed, Emily and Shadow continued their weekly routine, but there was something new in the air. Shadow was always eager to play and explore, but he seemed to be growing restless. He was used to the open spaces on the farm, running freely, and now the backyard, though big, didn't seem as exciting as it once had been. One day, Mrs. Carson noticed Shadow pacing by the door, looking out at the road. "I think he's ready for a new adventure," she said to Emily, smiling. "He's always been so brave. Maybe we should take him on a real adventure outside the yard." Emily's eyes lit up. "Like what?" Mrs. Carson thought for a moment. "What about a hiking trip? There's a beautiful trail up in the mountains not far from here. It's perfect for dogs, and Shadow would love it." The idea was exciting. Emily and Shadow had always shared adventures, but this time they would be together in the wild, exploring new places. Emily immediately agreed, and Mrs. Carson helped plan the trip. The hiking trip. The day of the hike arrived, and Emily could barely contain her excitement. Shadow was already waiting by the door, his leash in his mouth, tail wagging furiously. It was as if he knew an adventure was about to begin. They drove to the trailhead, the mountains rising in the distance, covered with trees and the scent of pine. As they began their hike, Shadow trotted happily beside Emily, his nose twitching with excitement at all the new smells. The forest around them was quiet, except for the sounds of birds singing and the occasional rustling of leaves underfoot. The trail was beautiful, with streams of cool water trickling over rocks and tall trees reaching for the sky. Shadow ran ahead, sniffing the ground, his energy endless. Emily smiled as she watched him explore, feeling a sense of peace she hadn't known in a while. But as they walked deeper into the forest, the trail became more difficult. The path was narrow, and the rocks were slippery. Emily stumbled a little, but Shadow, always watchful, turned around and ran back to her side. He nudged her gently with his nose, as if saying, "Be careful, I'm here." Emily laughed. "Thanks, boy. I'm okay." They continued on, the adventure growing more thrilling with every step. Shadow bounded over rocks, leaping from one to the next with ease, and Emily followed closely behind. It was a perfect day. She had never felt so connected to Shadow or the world around her. A sudden danger. But then, something unexpected happened. As they reached the top of the hill, a loud growl echoed through the trees. Emily froze. It sounded like a wild animal, and she wasn't sure what it was. Shadow's ears perked up, and he stood still, looking in the direction of the sound. Before Emily could react, the growl came closer. Shadow instinctively stepped in front of her, growling low, his body tense. "Shadow," Emily whispered, fear creeping into her voice. "What's going on?" Then, out of the shadows, a large coyote appeared, its eyes gleaming in the fading light. It wasn't close, but it was watching them, moving cautiously in their direction. Emily's heart pounded. She knew wild animals could be dangerous, especially to someone as small as her. But she also knew Shadow was brave. He had protected her before, and he would protect her now. Without hesitation, Shadow stood taller, his body blocking Emily, and let out a powerful bark. The coyote took a step back, but didn't leave. Shadow continued to bark, louder this time, and the coyote, sensing the dog's strength, decided it wasn't worth the fight. With a last glance at Emily, it turned and disappeared into the forest. A hero's moment. Emily breathed a sigh of relief, her heart still racing. Shadow turned to her, his tail wagging proudly. "You did it, Shadow," Emily said, her voice full of admiration. "You protected me again." Shadow looked up at her, his eyes soft but determined. He had saved her once more, proving that his love and loyalty knew no limits. As they continued their hike, Emily knew one thing for sure: no matter where life took them, no matter what adventures awaited, Shadow would always be by her side. They shared a bond that was unbreakable, and it would last forever. "Shadow, what's wrong?" Emily asked, kneeling down to examine his paw. He winced when she touched it, and Emily's worry deepened. She quickly called Mrs. Carson. "Shadow's hurt," she said, panic in her voice. "He's limping, and I think something's wrong with his paw." Mrs. Carson rushed over, and the two of them carefully examined Shadow. They saw that his paw was swollen, and there was a small cut on one of his pads. "He must have hurt it during the hike," Mrs. Carson said, concern in her voice. "We need to take him to the vet." The vet visit. That afternoon, Emily and Mrs. Carson drove Shadow to the local vet. The office smelled of clean, sterile air, and Shadow seemed uneasy. He had always been calm, but today he was clearly nervous. Emily gently petted him, trying to comfort him. When they were called in, the vet, Dr. Harris, examined Shadow's paw. "It's a small injury, but we need to make sure it doesn't get infected," Dr. Harris explained. "We'll clean it up, put a bandage on it, and keep him off it for a while. He should heal in a few days." Emily sighed in relief. "Thank goodness." Dr. Harris smiled. "He's lucky to have such a caring owner. Just make sure he rests for now. No running or hiking for at least a week." Emily nodded, feeling a little better. She stayed with Shadow in the vet's office until they were ready to go home. As they left, she hugged him close, whispering, "I'll take care of you, Shadow. I promise." A tough week. The following week was a tough one. Shadow had to stay inside and rest, which was difficult for him. He wasn't used to being so still. Normally, he would be running around in the yard, chasing birds or playing fetch with Emily. But now he had to lie down and let his paw heal. Emily took extra care of him. She brought him his favorite toys, gave him special treats, and even spent more time by his side, just sitting and talking to him. It was hard for both of them, but Emily knew it was what Shadow needed to heal. One evening, as they sat together on the porch, Emily looked at Shadow, who was lying next to her, his head resting on her lap. She gently stroked his fur. "You're going to be okay, Shadow," she whispered. "We've been through so much together, and we'll get through this too." Shadow raised his head slightly, looking up at her with his warm brown eyes. He seemed to understand, and his tail wagged weakly in response. It wasn't much, but it was enough to remind Emily that no matter what, Shadow was still the brave dog who had saved her life. A new challenge. As the week passed, Shadow began to feel better, but Emily could tell he was still a little cautious. He was eager to get back to his usual routine, but he took small, careful steps. Then, one day, something happened that changed everything. Emily had just returned home from school when she noticed a strange noise coming from the kitchen. It sounded like something was knocking over, followed by a soft crash. Shadow had always been calm and well-behaved, so Emily immediately grew concerned. "Shadow," she called, stepping into the kitchen. Her heart raced as she looked around, but there was no sign of him. The noise had stopped, but it had been enough to make her worry. "Shadow," she called again, moving through the house, checking each room. Finally, she found him, standing in the hallway, his body tense. There was something wrong, but she couldn't figure out what. Just then, Emily saw the open door to the garage. A feeling of dread crept over her. The garage was always kept locked, but somehow it had been left open. When Emily walked toward the door, she gasped. Inside, there was a large box, tipped over, and standing beside it was a snake, its head raised, ready to strike. A hero once again. Emily froze in fear. The snake was dangerous, and she knew she needed to act fast. But before she could think clearly, Shadow bolted past her, barking loudly. He ran straight toward the snake, his body low, growling fiercely. "No, Shadow!" Emily screamed, but it was too late. Shadow leaped at the snake, his teeth bared, and in one swift movement, he bit down on the snake's body. The snake hissed and thrashed, but Shadow held on, his jaws locked tightly around it. "Shadow!" Emily cried, running toward him. She was terrified for him, but she knew he wasn't going to back down. He was protecting her again, just like he had done so many times before. With one final shake, Shadow threw the snake to the ground, its body limp. He stepped back, watching it closely to make sure it was no longer a threat. Shadow stood tall, his tail wagging as if to say, "I'm always here for you." Emily hugged him tightly, knowing that the bond they shared would never be broken. Shadow had proven, once again, that his loyalty and love for her were unshakable. They had both been through so much together, and no matter what came next, they would face it together, side by side. The weeks after Shadow's encounter with the snake passed quickly. Emily was more grateful than ever for Shadow's bravery. He had saved her from another danger, and she could see that his love and loyalty for her were endless. However, it was clear that Shadow was more than just her protector. He was her family. They had a bond that was unbreakable, and nothing could change that. But as much as Emily cherished their time together, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was coming, something that would test their bond in ways they hadn't yet experienced. A sudden emergency. One evening, Emily's mom, Sarah, received a call from the school. There had been an accident in town. A car had gone off the road near the old bridge, and it was urgent. Emily's dad, Mike, quickly grabbed his jacket, and Emily could see the worry in his eyes. "I'll go with your mom to the hospital," Mike said, turning to Emily. "You stay here with Shadow, okay?" Emily nodded, though she could tell her dad was nervous. It was a serious situation, and her parents wanted to make sure everything was okay. As they left, Emily felt a strange unease in her chest. Something didn't feel right. When they left, Emily turned to Shadow, who was sitting quietly by the door, as if he sensed the tension in the air. "What do you think, Shadow? Something doesn't feel right, does it?" she said softly. Shadow looked up at her, his eyes full of understanding. He padded over to her side and sat down, resting his head on her lap. Emily stroked his fur gently, feeling comforted by his presence, but deep down she couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The storm arrives. That night, a heavy storm rolled in. The wind howled through the trees, and rain poured down in sheets. Emily couldn't sleep, her mind racing with worry about her parents and the accident. She glanced at Shadow, who was lying on the floor beside her bed, as calm as always. But then the house shook. The wind gusted so hard against the windows that it sounded like the house might break. Emily jumped out of bed, her heart pounding. "Shadow, what's happening?" she whispered. Shadow was up instantly, his ears alert. He walked to the window and sniffed the air, his body tense. He seemed to sense something beyond the storm. Suddenly, there was a loud crash. The power went out, and the room was plunged into darkness. Emily's heart raced, and she tried to call out to her parents, but they weren't there. She felt a sudden wave of fear. What if something had happened to them? Shadow's eyes were glowing in the dim light of the moon, and he stood by the door, waiting. Emily hesitated for a moment, then followed him, feeling as if she had no choice but to trust her dog. They moved cautiously through the house, the storm howling outside, and Emily felt the hair on the back of her neck stand up. She grabbed her phone and tried to call her parents, but there was no signal. Panic rose in her chest. The strangers in the night. As they neared the back door, Emily heard something. Footsteps. Slow and deliberate. Someone was outside. Shadow's body stiffened, and he growled softly. Emily froze, her breath caught in her throat. "Who's there?" she whispered, but there was no answer. Shadow barked loudly, warning the intruders that they were not welcome. The footsteps stopped. Emily's pulse raced. Was it someone she knew? Or was it someone dangerous? Suddenly, the door shook. Someone was trying to force it open. "Shadow," Emily whispered urgently. "Stay close to me." The dog barked again, louder this time, his tail stiff and his body ready to defend her. The door creaked as someone pushed harder against it. Emily's heart raced as she backed away slowly, holding her phone tightly in her hand. She had no idea what was happening, but she knew she wasn't alone. And neither was Shadow. Shadow's heroic moment. In that moment, Emily realized just how much Shadow had grown since she had first met him. He wasn't just the dog who had saved her life on that night months ago. He was now the protector of their home, standing strong against whatever dangers might come. Just then, the door gave way with a loud crash, and a man stepped into the doorway. Emily's heart skipped a beat. He was tall and menacing, his face shadowed by the storm. But before he could move any closer, Shadow sprang into action. With a fierce bark, Shadow leaped at the man, blocking his path. The man recoiled in surprise, stumbling back. Shadow barked again, this time louder and more aggressive, showing the intruder that he was no match for a dog as brave as him. "Get back," Emily shouted, her voice shaking, but steady. "Leave us alone." The man hesitated, clearly caught off guard by Shadow's bravery. He looked down at the dog, then back at Emily, unsure of what to do next. Shadow didn't move, keeping himself between Emily and the stranger.